Victor the Viper Moretti, Selena Cruz, and Jamal Kingpin Hayes didn't just break the law, they rewrote it. From the streets of Chicago to the back alleys of Los Angeles, these names became legends, feared by rivals and untouchable to the law. But behind every empire of blood and money lay betrayal, violence, and secrets that could destroy them all. This is the story of America's deadliest crime bosses, where there were no rules and no mercy. The streets of America's largest cities appeared alive with energy and opportunity. But beneath the neon lights and crowded avenues, a darker world thrived. In neighborhoods where poverty met ambition, crime bosses rose quietly, unnoticed by most, but feared by all who dared cross their paths. Their power was invisible yet absolute, built not on charm or politics, but on control, intimidation, and a ruthless understanding of human nature. Every corner, alleyway, and abandoned building could be their domain, and every whisper of disobedience could bring a violent end. People learned to speak softly, to move cautiously, and to avoid drawing attention. Even law enforcement often seemed powerless, chasing shadows while the true rulers remained untouchable, their identities known only to a few. These bosses came from all walks of life, but most shared a history of struggle. Childhood spent in violence, neglect, or extreme poverty shaped them into calculating predators. They quickly learned that mercy could be deadly, and hesitation even more so. From small-scale hustles, petty thefts, and local street trades, they observed the vulnerabilities of others and exploited them with precision. Each minor crime, each stolen shipment, and each carefully orchestrated con drew them closer to the networks that would eventually make them untouchable. In this world, loyalty was a commodity, fear was a currency, and reputation could be worth more than money. A single act of violence could signal dominance across an entire city, and the slightest weakness could invite ruin. The boss's empires were rarely obvious. Front businesses masked illicit operations, cash flowed through hidden channels, and entire communities became silent witnesses to crimes that seemed impossible to prosecute. Police often knew the names but lacked the proof, while neighbors learned the unspoken rule of silence: speak and disappear, look and vanish. Smuggling, racketeering, and money laundering were executed with careful attention to detail, each step planned to avoid detection while maximizing profit and influence. These hidden systems allowed crime bosses to expand, not just locally, but across states, leaving trails of control that only became clear years later. Power for these men and women was intoxicating. They weren't satisfied with money alone. Fear was equally valuable. Every disappearance, every brutal warning, and every act of intimidation reinforced their rule. Communities were reshaped according to their whims, entire districts operating under the shadow of their influence. Even rival gangs had to acknowledge their dominance, often negotiating under duress, knowing that resistance could lead to death. Ambition was a constant, driving them forward with a hunger that seemed insatiable. Yet, despite their control, the world around them was fragile. One miscalculation, one informant, or one sudden act of betrayal could start a chain reaction that would destroy everything built over decades. But at this early stage, in the rise of America's deadliest crime bosses, the streets were theirs to command. The cities themselves became the stage for an intricate game of power, deception, and survival, where the strongest would emerge unchallenged and the weakest would disappear without a trace. In this world, there were no rules, no mercy, and no limits to the darkness a human could embrace. Most of America's deadliest crime bosses did not inherit power or wealth. They were born into struggle, into neighborhoods where opportunity was scarce and danger was constant. From the very beginning, they learned to navigate a world where trust was rare, and survival depended on cunning, aggression, and the ability to anticipate threats. Childhoods were marked by the harsh realities of street life. Gangs, violence, drugs, and poverty shaped their understanding of the world. From an early age, They discovered that weakness was exploited, and that fear could be a weapon more powerful than any fist. These lessons, learned in playgrounds and abandoned lots, became the foundation of their future empires. In their teenage years, small hustles became the proving grounds for ambition. Selling stolen goods, running errands for local gang leaders, or participating in minor thefts were not just crimes, they were tests of intelligence, loyalty, and ruthlessness. Success brought respect, while failure brought punishment. Each action was calculated, every mistake remembered. The streets became a classroom where the most dangerous lessons were learned through first-hand experience. It was here that they observed the patterns of human behavior, learning who could be manipulated, intimidated, or eliminated. Alliances were forged, not out of friendship, but out of necessity. Partners were chosen based on utility, loyalty, and potential for profit. As they grew older, these young criminals began to expand their operations. Small street-level dealings transformed into organized networks. They discovered the importance of structure and strategy. Bosses did not rise by brute force alone. They combined intimidation with intelligence. Smuggling routes were mapped out with care. Rival factions were watched, and the smallest leaks of information could be exploited. They learned to exploit loopholes in law enforcement, corrupt officials where possible, and create layers of protection that insulated them from immediate danger. Each step upward required patience and planning. A premature move could lead to arrest, death, or the collapse of their growing network. Every success strengthened their reputation, and every failure taught a lesson they would never forget. Ambition fueled their hunger for power, and soon petty hustles were no longer enough. They started to take risks that others would avoid, seizing territories controlled by more established gangs and asserting dominance through fear and violence. Each victory expanded their influence, attracting followers willing to enforce their orders without question. They surrounded themselves with loyal operatives who executed commands ruthlessly, further cementing the boss's authority. At the same time, they observed the mistakes of others, learning from rivals' falls to avoid the same pitfalls. By the time they reached early adulthood, these future crime bosses had transformed into calculating leaders. They understood that patience, intimidation, and precision were far more effective than impulsive violence. They had learned to manipulate people, systems, and circumstances to their advantage. They had risen from nothing, yet they now commanded fear and respect on a scale few could imagine. What began as survival had evolved into ambition, and ambition had evolved into the unstoppable drive to dominate entire cities. The streets that once seemed oppressive were now their domain, and the empire they were building would soon make them untouchable in ways the world could hardly comprehend. By the time America's deadliest crime bosses reached their prime, their operations had evolved far beyond street-level hustles. They had learned that survival alone was not enough. To achieve lasting power, they needed systems, networks, and structures that mirrored legitimate businesses but operated in complete secrecy. Their empires were meticulously constructed, combining fear, influence, and strategy. No detail was too small. Every operation, every associate, and every transaction was calculated to ensure maximum profit while minimizing risk. Unlike chaotic street gangs, these bosses created organizations that were disciplined, hierarchical, and ruthlessly efficient. At the heart of their success was organization. Territories were divided, responsibilities assigned, and communications controlled. Lieutenants oversaw operations, while foot soldiers executed orders without hesitation. Leaders rarely exposed themselves, operating from the shadows to avoid detection. Front businesses, car washes, nightclubs, restaurants served as facades for laundering money, coordinating illegal trades, and shielding their identities. Legal systems were manipulated, taxes skirted, and profits funneled through legitimate accounts. This intricate web allowed crime bosses to operate undisturbed while law enforcement scrambled to keep up. Expansion was not limited to a single city. Ambition drove these bosses to stretch their reach across states. connecting with other criminal networks and establishing smuggling routes that crossed regional and even national borders. Drugs, weapons, and stolen goods moved seamlessly through these channels, with bribed officials and corrupted law enforcement officers ensuring minimal interference. Communication was coded, meetings were discreet, and trust was both earned and continuously tested. Every decision was made with the knowledge that a single misstep could dismantle years of effort. Control was enforced through a combination of fear and incentive. Communities became reluctant partners, learning that compliance ensured safety while defiance brought violence. Rivals were neutralized or absorbed, leaving no room for competition. Every action reinforced the boss's authority, and the mere rumor of punishment was often enough to maintain order. Violence was carefully orchestrated. It was not chaos, but a strategic tool. Executions, disappearances, and intimidation served as warnings, sending clear messages to anyone considering betrayal or opposition. Reputation, once established, became as powerful as any weapon. Yet the brilliance of these crime bosses lay in their ability to hide in plain sight. To outsiders, they appeared as ordinary businessmen, property owners, or respected members of the community. Their presence in legitimate society provided cover, influence, and access. Networking with influential figures, donating to charities, or attending public events created an image of normalcy while the empire behind the curtain continued to thrive. Each calculated move was part of a larger strategy: remain untouchable while maintaining absolute control. Despite the empire's sophistication, the foundation was always fear and loyalty. Associates understood that disobedience could be fatal, while loyalty was rewarded with protection and wealth. These systems allowed crime bosses to expand rapidly without losing control. By the time law enforcement realized the scope of their operations, entire cities were already under their influence. Streets, neighborhoods, and even institutions were subtly reshaped according to the will of men and women who had risen from nothing to become untouchable rulers. Their empires were silent, invisible, and deadly proof that in the world of America's deadliest crime bosses, strategy was as lethal as violence. Violence was never random in the world of America's deadliest crime bosses. It was deliberate, precise, and terrifyingly effective. It was their primary tool for maintaining control, enforcing loyalty, and eliminating threats. Every act of brutality carried a purpose, a message designed to instill fear, not just in rivals, but in anyone who might consider defiance. It was a language everyone understood. Survival depended on obedience, and failure to comply could result in sudden, irreversible consequences. Even those who claimed neutrality learned quickly that silence did not guarantee safety, for the boss's reach was long and their memory unforgiving. The violence was both psychological and physical. Rumors spread faster than bullets, and sometimes a threat alone sufficed to bend someone to a boss's will. Entire neighborhoods became conditioned to the presence of danger, recognizing subtle signals, gestures, or unexplained disappearances as warnings. Streets that once bustled with life would grow tense at the mere rumor of a crime boss's visit, and local residents learned to adjust their behavior accordingly. Fear became an invisible chain, binding communities to the will of those who controlled the shadows. Physical violence, when deployed, was swift and extreme. Rivals often vanished without a trace, leaving law enforcement with only speculation and witnesses too terrified to speak. Assassinations were carefully executed, designed to eliminate threats efficiently while sending unmistakable warnings. Betrayal, whether real or perceived, was punished immediately. The bosses operated with the understanding that mercy was a liability. Hesitation was deadly. Every act of brutality was calculated to strengthen their grip, and each violent display reinforced the perception that defiance carried a cost too high to bear. Yet violence was not used indiscriminately. Crime bosses applied it strategically, targeting those who challenged their authority while preserving the loyalty of those who could be useful. Trusted associates who demonstrated unwavering commitment were protected and rewarded, while those who wavered were reminded of the consequences. This dual approach created a delicate balance. Fear ensured compliance, while selective incentives encouraged allegiance. It was a system of control that left no room for error, and the bosses thrived because they understood human psychology better than anyone around them. The most shocking aspect of their violence was its invisibility to the wider world. Outside their territories, life appeared normal. There were no daily headlines reporting the disappearances, no obvious signs of the power struggle beneath the surface. The bosses created an ecosystem where terror existed in shadows, whispers, and sudden, unexplained acts of brutality. Law enforcement often arrived too late, piecing together crimes that were only fragments of a much larger strategy. Their enemies were eliminated before they could mount a real challenge, and communities learned to exist in the margins, adapting silently to the invisible rules imposed by those who ruled through fear. This system of calculated brutality allowed crime bosses to expand without significant resistance. Violence became both a shield and a weapon, a means to enforce control and deter any form of opposition. By mastering fear, these men and women transformed entire districts into extensions of their will. No act was wasted, no threat underestimated. The streets themselves became instruments of obedience, and the consequences of defiance were etched into the collective consciousness of everyone living under their influence. In this world, strength was measured not in numbers or wealth, but in the ability to command fear and to strike with precision whenever necessary. The rule was simple. In a world without mercy, only the ruthless survived. Beneath the public facade of their empires, America's deadliest crime bosses waged wars that few ever saw. These were not chaotic street fights or impulsive acts of violence. They were calculated, silent battles fought in the shadows, where information, influence, and timing were as lethal as any weapon. Rival bosses monitored each other constantly, analyzing movements, alliances, and vulnerabilities. Every deal, every shipment, and every handshake could hide a threat. The balance of power was fragile, and one misstep could unravel years of planning, turning dominance into disaster almost overnight. These hidden wars were fought with precision. Intelligence was gathered relentlessly, often through networks of informants, corrupted officials, or even unsuspecting civilians. A single piece of information could alter strategies, expose weaknesses, or create opportunities to strike. Bosses would manipulate markets, sabotage rivals' operations, or turn allies into enemies, all without firing a shot in public. Their understanding of human behavior allowed them to predict reactions, exploiting fear, greed, and ambition to weaken opposition from within. Every action was part of a larger chessboard, and the stakes were always life or death. Loyalty was both weapon and vulnerability. Trusted associates carried out attacks, but they could also betray the boss if persuaded or pressured. Relationships were constantly tested, with loyalty measured against fear, greed, and opportunity. Betrayals often came from within, sometimes from the most unexpected sources. Lieutenants or family members who had long served faithfully might suddenly switch sides, driven by survival instinct or ambition. These betrayals were devastating, because the most dangerous wars were the ones fought quietly, in secret, without public confrontation. A rival could fall not because of a violent ambush, but because someone in their inner circle had made the wrong choice at the wrong time. Even when violence erupted, it was only the tip of the iceberg. The true battles were invisible, fought through manipulation, strategy, and intimidation. Bosses employed misdirection, spreading rumors, staging incidents, and creating diversions to weaken their opponents. They studied law enforcement's patterns, exploiting gaps and avoiding detection while subtly undermining rivals. By the time a public conflict appeared, it was often the result of months, even years, of secret planning and maneuvering. These wars reshaped entire criminal networks. with territories changing hands and alliances collapsing without anyone outside the inner circle noticing until the consequences were already permanent. Financial warfare was equally critical. Control of supply chains, smuggling routes, and money laundering operations could make or break an empire. Bosses attacked rivals economically, cutting off resources, seizing shipments, or infiltrating businesses to drain funds. Even the wealthiest criminal empire was vulnerable if its money or influence was undermined. Strategic pressure, carefully applied, could force rivals into submission without a single gunshot, proving that power was not just about brute force, it was about foresight, patience, and understanding the complex web of dependencies that governed the underworld. The hidden wars demanded constant vigilance. Every decision carried risk, and the difference between survival and annihilation was often measured in seconds. The bosses who thrived were those who anticipated moves before they happened, who turned betrayal into opportunity, and who wielded fear as both shield and weapon. In this silent battlefield, victory was never guaranteed, but for those who mastered the game, the rewards were immense. Influence, wealth, and near absolute control over territories that stretched far beyond the public eye. These secret conflicts were the lifeblood of their empires, the invisible currents that determined who would rise, who would fall, and who would vanish entirely without a trace. Even the most powerful criminal empires eventually show cracks, and America's deadliest crime bosses were no exception. For years, they had operated above the law, untouchable in their carefully constructed networks. Their control seemed absolute, their influence unshakable. But empires built on fear and secrecy are inherently fragile. A single misstep, a careless conversation, a financial error, or a misplaced trust could set off a chain reaction that would unravel years of planning. While these bosses had survived rivals, betrayals, and law enforcement for decades, the foundations of their power were slowly weakening, almost imperceptibly. The first signs of collapse often came from within. Trusted lieutenants, who had long enforced orders without question, began to see opportunities for themselves. Loyalty, which had once been bought and enforced through fear, became negotiable. Some insiders began cooperating with law enforcement, providing information in exchange for protection or reduced sentences. Even the smallest betrayal could compromise key operations, exposing routes, assets, and associates. What had once been a tightly controlled empire started to show vulnerabilities, with gaps that were quickly exploited by rivals, authorities, or opportunistic underlings. Financial pressures also played a critical role in the beginning of the downfall. Maintaining an empire required constant reinvestment, careful money laundering, and discreet handling of profits. But mistakes, mismanagement, or interference from competitors could disrupt cash flows. Smuggling routes were intercepted, shipments seized, and revenue streams cut off. Bosses who had once relied on intimidation alone now faced challenges that could not be solved with violence. Their empires were vast, but wealth is only valuable when it can be controlled, and cracks in financial management made even the most dominant leaders vulnerable. Law enforcement, too, began to adapt. For years, police departments and federal agencies had been outmaneuvered, chasing fragmented leads while bosses operated with near impunity. Slowly, investigative techniques improved. Surveillance became more sophisticated, data networks were monitored, and informants began to emerge from the shadows. Investigators pieced together clues that had long been overlooked, connecting seemingly unrelated incidents into patterns that revealed the structure of criminal operations. The bosses who had once laughed at raids and subpoenas now faced coordinated efforts that left little room for error. Pressure from all sides intensified when internal betrayal intersected with legal scrutiny. Associates turned informants, financial errors were traced, and law enforcement finally had the evidence needed to strike. The empire, which had appeared invincible, started to crumble. Those who had relied solely on fear and intimidation found themselves vulnerable. And even their reputation as untouchable leaders could not shield them from the mounting consequences. Territories were lost, influence waned, and enemies sensed weakness, emboldened by the cracks they now observed. Despite the encroaching danger, the bosses fought to maintain control, often resorting to desperate measures. Orders were enforced more ruthlessly, alliances were tested, and threats escalated. But the momentum had shifted. What had once been an unstoppable force of fear and strategy now faced an inevitable reckoning. Slowly but surely, the very systems that had built their power networks of loyalty, fear, and money became the instruments of their downfall. In the world of America's deadliest crime bosses, the higher the empire, the farther it could fall, and the cracks that had long been invisible were finally beginning to expose everything they had worked to protect. The most devastating blows to America, as deadliest crime bosses, rarely came from outside forces. They came from within. For years, these men and women had ruled through fear, loyalty, and careful calculation, but even the most loyal associates had limits. Self-preservation often outweighed allegiance, and when law enforcement offered protection or immunity, the temptation became irresistible. The betrayals that followed were swift, shocking, and often complete, shattering empires that had seemed untouchable for decades. Friends, lieutenants, and even family members became informants, their knowledge unraveling years of careful secrecy. Betrayals were rarely gradual. They happened suddenly, like a dam breaking. A trusted lieutenant who had executed countless orders without question might reveal critical information overnight. Surveillance records, financial documents, and names of associates were handed over, exposing networks that had operated undetected for years. Operations once thought secure were suddenly vulnerable. Smuggling routes were intercepted, money trails uncovered, and entire territories left defenseless. The bosses who had relied on fear and intimidation discovered that terror could only protect them for so long. Loyalty, it seemed, was far more fragile than they had imagined. The consequences of these betrayals were immediate and brutal. Law enforcement struck fast, coordinating raids, arrests, and seizures. The speed of the crackdown left little time for the bosses to react. Assets were frozen, accounts emptied, and territories lost to rivals who had long waited for signs of weakness. Even the most cunning leaders, who had predicted threats from rivals or the authorities, could not anticipate the depth and scope of betrayal from those closest to them. Every act of disloyalty compounded the chaos, dismantling the intricate systems that had taken decades to construct. These betrayals also exposed the bosses to psychological torment. Their sense of control, once absolute, was shattered. Friends had become enemies. Family members had become informants, and the networks they had depended on for protection dissolved before their eyes. The fear they had wielded so effectively was turned back on them. The same tactics they had used to dominate cities and enforce obedience now became the instruments of their downfall. They learned, too late, that in a world built on intimidation, trust was the most dangerous and rare commodity of all. Even as arrests were made and trials commenced, the ripple effects of betrayal continued. Associates who had remained silent for decades testified, revealing details that no one outside the inner circle could have imagined. The empires of these crime bosses, once untouchable, crumbled under the weight of their own secrets. Rival factions rushed to claim territories, attempting to fill the void left by leaders who were suddenly exposed and incapacitated. The chaos that followed was as relentless as it was inevitable, proving that no empire, no matter how powerful, could survive when loyalty failed. In the end, the most shocking truth about America's deadliest crime bosses was not their ability to inflict fear, but their vulnerability to those they trusted most. Betrayal, when it arrived, was absolute, swift, and final. The same people who had enforced orders, protected territories, and maintained secrecy now dismantled everything from within. Their downfall served as a stark reminder that in a world of no rules and no mercy, even the most ruthless leaders could be undone by the very human instinct to survive, revealing that power built on fear alone is never truly secure. Even after the most notorious crime bosses were arrested, imprisoned, or killed, their influence lingered. The destruction they had wrought on neighborhoods, families, and entire cities did not vanish overnight. Communities were left grappling with fear, mistrust, and economic instability long after the empires had fallen. Shops closed, streets emptied, and residents adapted to a new normal, shaped by years of intimidation and violence. The power vacuum left by the downfall of these bosses did not signal peace. Instead, it sparked competition among emerging criminals, each hoping to claim a portion of the territory and legacy left behind. The remnants of the empires continued to operate in subtle ways. Some former lieutenants stepped into leadership roles, attempting to maintain control over operations or protect themselves from law enforcement. Others sought revenge against rivals or betrayed former allies, perpetuating cycles of violence. The networks that had been carefully built were fragmented but not entirely destroyed. Money, influence, and knowledge remained in circulation, often hidden in plain sight through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, or loyal associates still at large. While the top leaders were gone, the systems they had created endured, quietly shaping crime in ways the public rarely understood. Families were often the silent victims of these empires. Children grew up with absent parents, either incarcerated or constantly moving to avoid danger. Loved ones of those involved in the criminal networks lived under constant stress, fearing retaliation for past alliances or debts. Even years later, the trauma lingered, affecting relationships, education, and opportunities. Generations were shaped not by choice, but by circumstance, with fear and survival instincts embedded into daily life. The bosses themselves, though removed from power, left psychological scars that outlasted any headline or court sentence. The legal system, while ultimately successful in dismantling many of these empires, faced its own challenges. Trials were long and complex, requiring evidence gathered over decades. Informants risked their lives to testify, while defense attorneys exploited loopholes and procedural errors. Even when convictions were secured, appeals and technicalities sometimes delayed justice. Yet the broader message remained clear. No matter how untouchable a criminal appeared, eventually accountability could catch up. Law enforcement agencies learned valuable lessons, developing strategies to prevent future empires from reaching the same scale of influence. New criminals inevitably emerged, inspired by the stories of their predecessors. Tales of power, wealth, and survival in a world without rules served as both warning and temptation. Yet most lacked the same skill, patience, or strategic insight that had allowed the original bosses to dominate. The landscape of crime shifted, more fragmented and visible, shaped by the memory of those who had ruled with no mercy. Fear remained, but it was tempered by the knowledge that even the most ruthless leaders could fall. In the end, the legacy of America's deadliest crime bosses was a mixture of destruction, survival, and cautionary lessons. Entire communities bore the scars of their reign, while law enforcement and society adapted to prevent history from repeating itself. Their stories serve as a reminder that in a world built on fear and secrecy, power is never permanent. Loyalty is fragile, and the consequences of ambition without morality can echo far beyond the lives of those who sought it. Even as new figures rise, the shadows of these fallen empires linger, a testament to the dangerous allure of power when rules are absent and mercy is non-existent.